Welcome to Breeze Time with Kathy. I thought I'd do something different today. I'd like to share with you something that was a tradition in my family. You see, November 1st was All Saints' Day. All Saints' Day in New Orleans is a big deal. Everybody goes to the cemeteries, everybody puts flowers on the tombs, and I have to admit, we have some fantastic tombs in the cemetery where my family tomb is in New Orleans. It's called Metaire Cemetary, and I'd like to share some of that. It's a beautiful park-like cemetery, and I know that sounds strange, but New Orleans is a strange place sometimes. I hope you enjoy. I'm going to tell you about New Orleans Metaire Cemetery. Some interesting stories. You see, this is what I'm talking about. When I was a kid, people used to put flowers out for All Saints' Day. This is clearly All Saints' Day because every tomb has flowers. People who had to keep the tombs up themselves, they used to whitewash them once a year and get them all ready for All Saints' Day. But the cemetery I want to talk about is Metaire Cemetery. That's where my family's tomb is. And Metaire Cemetery has a very colorful history. You see, it started there. The area was first developed as a racetrack. It was called Metaire Course Racetrack. And the thing is that a man, last name Howard, he made his money in about the 1850s or so he started a Louisiana lottery. Well, a lot of people didn't approve of the lottery back then any more than some people don't approve of it now. But what they did was one day he went to the track and he wanted to go into the clubhouse. However, they told him he couldn't be admitted to the clubhouse. It seems they blackballed him because his money, it wasn't that he wasn't rich, because he was probably as rich as anybody who belonged to the club. But his money was new money, not old New Orleans money. Well, he was quite outdone. And it is said that he then said, I'm going to buy this racetrack and turn it into a cemetery. That's what he said he was going to do. See, there he is, Charles T. Howard. And lo and behold, after the Civil War, when the racetrack was in financial difficulty, Charles T. Howard bought the racetrack and he turned it into a cemetery. And as you can see right here, that is the original oval of the racetrack right there. Yes, he did. Well, he built that in the 1870s, and this is an aerial shot of it, and this is what it looks like, and you can see the racetrack laid out very clearly. Well, Mr. Howard, of course, has a very nice tomb right there in the cemetery, and it quickly he developed it with large park-like setting. He had fountains, he had lagoons, and it was very much a park-like cemetery. And of course, in New Orleans, the custom is to bury above ground. They had a problem with the water table, then it was just easier not to fight with it and worry about trying to keep tombs in the ground. They just followed a custom which is used in Europe in some places when they did all their burials above ground. Mr. Howard fixed himself a nice fancy tomb. As a matter of fact, he has wisdom sitting there. This man is supposed to be wisdom personified. And if you look, it bears, he was the model for wisdom. Talk about a man with an ego, huh? Well, the cemetery caught on. It was quite fashionable in the 1880s, 1890s, and all the way through probably the 30s and 40s for people to go to the cemeteries on Sunday. It was quite a place for an outing. My mother did it. She was born in 1916, and she remembers going to the cemetery, at least once a month or so, and they would stroll around, and they'd visit the family tomb, but then they'd go visit other people's tombs. You see the lagoons that they had? Very much a park-like setting back then. And even a lot of people had chairs. You see the chairs sitting here? They would sit out in front of the tombs, and people would come by and they'd visit. Sunday afternoon was the time to go to the cemetery. A place to see people and be seen. So here's an example from today of some of the cast iron chairs that still sit in front of some of the tombs. It was quite amazing the way it's all laid out. It's really a beautiful cemetery. This is what the gates looked like when my mother was a child, and the gates have since changed. It's not the gates I knew, but it's the one she knew when they used to drive out there and it was a long drive to go out to the cemetery. This monument is the tallest private monument in the country. And it was made by a man named Mr. Moriarty, and he built this when his wife died. And there's actually 4 statues. You see those 4 women around the top of the statues? There's one on the other side you can't see. And the joke is that it's faith, hope, and charity, and then the 4th one is Mrs. Moriarty. These are some of you can see how elaborate the tombs are. Even when people are buried in the ground, they usually build a coping around it and raise it up. This particular tomb, this is the many Confederate societies buried the veterans here in the cemetery. This particular one was for Stonewall Jackson's, the army that was headed by Stonewall Jackson, and that's a statue of Stonewall Jackson on the top, though he's not buried there. It was the Louisiana Division. Now this one is actually a Civil War era person. His name is Reverend Markham. Reverend Markham was the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church. And actually my great-great-grandmother belonged to that church. My great-great-grandmother, great-great-grandfather, they had come to Louisiana. Let's see, he'd come around 1820, and then he went back to Ireland. They were Irish Protestants. And he'd married Liza Jane Caldwell. And then they came back, and so they were staunch Presbyterians. And Reverend Markham had the First Presbyterian Church. And my grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, Liza Jane, was a teetotaler. She didn't believe in alcohol. However, she kept 1 bottle of sherry from when Dr. Markham visited, because he liked sherry. But aside from that, she kept it in the cupboard under lock and key. And it was only taken out when Reverend Markham came. As a matter of fact, Reverend Markham married my great-grandparents. And he was very active. But probably, besides being a famous pastor, this is Reverend Markham right here. One of the things he's most noted for is he was a chaplain of the Confederate Army, and he was pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in New Orleans during the occupation of the Civil War. New Orleans was captured fairly early in the Civil War, and it was administered by General Butler. And this is from the Wax Museum in New Orleans, and what you see here is General Butler sitting there, and in the background you see the tower of the First Presbyterian Church, and this is Reverend Markham, supposedly. This story was quite famous in New Orleans because General Butler called Reverend Markham to his office. And he said, "Reverend Markham, I've heard a disturbing report that you refused to bury a Union soldier from First Presbyterian Church." And quite famously, Reverend Markham replied, "That is untrue, General Butler. I would gladly bury every Union soldier from First Presbyterian Church." So he was quite a character. If you look at the tomb, look at that funny little thing right there. What happened was in Hurricane Betsy, the top pedestal got knocked over and broken. So they repaired it. But of course you can never match the stone. But I think the stonemason did a very good job of finding a way to make it look good with that banded section. This is one of my favorites, monuments. It's not on a tomb, it's just there. Of course, it's more modern, probably from the 40s, the 50s, but it's a representation of the scripture passage. "And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and they shall study war no more." Boy, don't we all still look forward to that day. Now, this is an interesting tomb. This tomb was actually first built by court order. And you think, my goodness, why would the courts order the building of a tomb? Well, the reason is that this took place before the Titanic. But a mother and daughter were crossing on an ocean liner, and the ocean liner went down and both died. Well, there was a very famous court case in which they tried to decide who would get the inheritance. You see, the mother had the bulk of the estate, and though she left some to her daughter, though she left everything to her daughter, if her daughter predeceased her, then of course it went to somebody else. And so there was a big court battle trying to figure out, since they both drowned in the same shipwreck, who died first. Well, it was finally decided that the mother, being older, would have succumbed to the elements sooner than the daughter. And unfortunately, I was good friends. A doctor I worked with was a descendant of the family that lost this battle. And the inheritance did not come to them. But one of the things the judge decreed, that from the mother's estate, they had to build a memorial, which was this tomb, to the mother, and it also included the daughter, to the mother. And the design ended up being, you see the bow of the ship right here? And there's two angels clinging to each other to represent the mother and the daughter. Now, this is a good story, too. Now, J.V. Harrington was a gambler, very well known. He was quite famous. And unfortunately, when he died, his estate declared bankruptcy because he owed a lot of debts. Now, his wife, meanwhile, his widow, she had plans for this very fancy tomb. And if you notice, there's this bronze statue here in the front, which represents a woman sitting by the tomb and grieving for poor Mr. Harrington. And that, of course, represented the wife. Well, the judge who was handling the bankruptcy estate said, "We're not going to spend thousands of dollars on this tomb. The estate just doesn't have that kind of money. There's all kind of debts." So the wife said, "Well, what about if I build it myself?" And he says, "What, you have this kind of money?" And she opens up her purse and she pulls out all kinds of cash, which of course had somehow not been included in the estate. But I don't know how it happened, but she sure got this tomb built. And if you noticed, even to this day, people leave coins for him, because you never know when a gambler could use a lucky coin or two. There's all different kinds of styles in this cemetery. The Egyptian revival was very popular in cemetery design in the late 1800s, and that's largely because, and on into the 1920s, and that's largely because of all the Egyptology things that were being developed and culminated by the discovery of the tomb of King Tut. So this one is a quite famous one, a pyramid. Here's another one. This is actually one of the sphinxes that stand outside that tomb. And see the Egyptian motif right here? Unfortunately, she lost her fingers of this hand and her whole hand on that side, but this is a cemetery where people come through all the time, and it's exposed to the elements. And this tomb is probably over 100 years old. But I have to admit, the level of sculpture and the detail is very good. Very, very good. I've always wondered what face posed for that Sphinx. Now this is another one, sort of Egyptian influence. See the lotus branches and the columns, and that's actually the Bestoff family. The Bestoff family formed one of the biggest drugstore chains. They got together with someone named Katz and Bestoff, and K&B was the most famous drugstore chain when I was a child. Very interesting tomb. Of course, they didn't all go Egyptian. This one is Moorish in its design. It's got the dome ceiling and the arch and all the very intricate design. That was popular. Here's another example of Eastern Moorish influence architecture, but look, that's a Greek cross. That's an Orthodox cross on top. And there's another picture of that tomb. It even has intricate stained glass. Stained glass was pretty popular. Now this is the Egan tomb. It's very interesting. You think, well, what happened to this? Well, actually, it is a ruined chapel, because the Egan ancestral home in Europe had a chapel that was standing in ruins, and it was and they were inspired by that to build this tomb as this ruined chapel. So it always, this black on there was put on there to make it appear to be a ruined chapel. Of course, there's all these spectacular tombs, like you see here. Some of them even more ornate. I couldn't even begin to tell you what the design is. This is sort of that stone design that was very popular around 1900 or so. A Romanesque style. Look at that name, Salvador Pizzotti. Very ornate, very, I don't know what that is. I guess it's another Romanesque style. Now this is Lacoste. He was a famous hairdresser and designer in New Orleans, and it's considered to be one of the most expensive. This is white marble imported from Italy, and it's one of the most expensive tombs in the cemetery. Now, this one belongs to a politician. His name was Story, and he was quite famous. I'm going to remember that. I'll get back to him. Of course, Greek temples were very popular, and this particular Greek temple is quite a classic. Here's another Greek temple, basic. They used the finest granite, big bronze urns. Look at that detail. That thing is huge, weighs tons. Now don't forget the Irish. Here's a Celtic cross with the Celtic knots on it. Here's another one. This one stands very close to my family too. This is 15 feet tall. I remember looking at it when I was a child. Oh, this is Art Nouveau. Art Deco. It actually has stained glass back there, which was very popular. And this is a very fancy tomb. Not there again. It's not far from it's on the same section of the cemetery. I'm on the first curve of the racetrack is where my family tomb's located. And here's another one. You can see right through to see the stained glass windows. They were very popular. And some of the stained glass windows, that's the one in the tomb I just showed you, were quite beautiful. I really like them. You can see the influence of Tiffany in this style with the sort of iridescent glass here that makes up the cross. This one's quite lovely too. It gives a blue light all over that particular tomb. The cemeteries and lilies, of course, are very popular. Lilies represent eternal life, new life. Very popular even today at funerals. Now this tomb has a great story. You see J.A. Morales, that's not the person who built it. Nope. If you look at this is this beautiful granite. There's a woman standing at the door knocking, and the flames that burn ahead. It's actually Josie, and she was one of the most famous madams in New Orleans. You see, there was this, do you remember my politician I just spoke about, Story? Well, he decided that the way to clean up prostitution, you never were going to get rid of it. So what he did was he limited it to just one section of the city. And then he was going to tax it and to have doctors check the women and everything. Now this is Josie Arlington was her name, and she called her establishment the Arlington. And there sits the outside of the building. And it says, in this country you will find, nowhere in this country will you find a more complete and thorough sporting house than the Arlington. Absolutely and unquestionably the most decorative and costly outfitted sporting palace ever placed before the American public. Can you imagine that? I guess this was an advertisement for the Arlington. And it talked about the thousands of dollars to remodel and refurnish in this great mansion. And only the finest women worked there. I find that hard to believe. And of course, there's the Arlington. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a picture of it. Now, in 1918, when the U.S. Army came to New Orleans, 1917, right before World War I, rather, they shut down Storyville. Oh, by the way, the politician Story, he was quite upset when after he put it into a neighborhood and taxed it and got all this legislation to try and improve health, and he figured no way was prostitution going away. Then they went and named it after them, which he was always frustrated with. But this is what Storyville looked like. Interesting thing is that it was in the outer sections of most of these had music halls on the ground floor, little music halls, places that they could sit and entertain, and you would meet the girls, and then you could take advantage of the upstairs accommodations for any other activities you had in mind. But it was where jazz got started. New Orleans jazz started in these kinds of places. Louis Armstrong talked about playing in some of the sporting houses there in Storyville when he was young. And then, of course, it moved upriver to St. Louis and Memphis and all the other places. But that's where jazz got its start. Now, when Josie Arlington went ahead and designed this, she put this woman carrying flowers up on the door. They say that it represented the fact that her father turned her out and wouldn't let her back in the house. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But the tombs, of course, many female statues, grieving and mourning were very common throughout this cemetery. Big, beautiful bronze statues. These are beautiful bronzes. And there again, my family tomb is close by. Here we have an angel, and then we have two children. I guess they're dressed in about 1910, 1920, coming to visit the tomb. What I really liked about these children were how expressive they were. As a matter of fact, this child reminds me a lot of what my mother looked like when she was about this age in 1920 or so. Not to be forgotten is the famous dog. Every time we went to the cemetery, we had to drive past the dog. Now, it's not allowed, it wasn't allowed for pets to be buried in the cemetery. However, when the man that was buried in this tomb died, the dog's owner, the dog followed him from the house, because people were buried from the house in those days, to the cemetery. And then every day for the rest of the dog's life, in the morning he would get up, he'd go to the cemetery, he'd lay right there. And he did it for about 6 or 7 years until finally he passed away. And so they put the statue of the dog there in honor of him. And the dog used to wear, and still does, I see, have different ribbons or flowers tied around his neck. And of course, no one ever admitted to having done it. So that was real fascinating for a child. And there's the dog. Interesting enough, do you see the tears? Yep, the dog was crying. Louis Prima's buried there. He's a famous trumpeter, and one of his famous songs was Just a Gigolo. And if you look right here, this is his tomb. You notice that angel has a trumpet. Yep, not a surprise. And Louis Prima, a legend. When the end comes, I know they'll say, I was just a gigolo. This one is Mel Ott, famous baseball player. He actually came from the West Bank of New Orleans, just outside of New Orleans, a little place called Gretna, very near my little hometown of Belle Chase. Andrew Higgins. Andrew Higgins, the name may or may not mean anything to you, but you might have heard the name Higgins boat. And here's Andrew Higgins sitting on one of his Higgins boats. And it was the Higgins boat right here. This is from the World War II Museum in New Orleans. There is a Higgins boat. Lightweight, emptied in the front. It's what allowed the landings on the beaches to let the troops not have to have a port to debark, but to be able to land on beaches anywhere. As a matter of fact, he was often said it was the little boat that won the war, people said, in New Orleans anyway. Oh, there's Al Copeland, and there's his tomb. He's the one who did Popeye's biscuits. Food is very famous in New Orleans. You might have eaten at Ruth's Chris Steakhouse in your life, and yes, she was from New Orleans, and the first Ruth's Chris was in New Orleans, and she was right there. Now, this is a tradition. I think you might have heard of this one. Going to the cemetery, you play somber music, oftentimes just a closer walk with thee. But when you leave the cemetery, everybody cheers because the person has finished their journey, is in heaven, and there they are, second lining. I talked about it. We did a second line. I didn't have an umbrella, but for my friend Clara's funeral just last week. And angels. We have a ton of angels. Angels writing in the books, keeping track of the good deeds that people do. Angels, guardian angels watching over children. Angels grieving. Michael the archangel ready to do battle against Satan and anybody else. Some of them are quite stunning. But the most beautiful angel in the cemetery, as far as I'm concerned, is the one right here in this tomb. This tomb has a Greek design. It's the tomb of Chapman Hines. It's just a few, not very far, just a few steps from my own family tomb. And behind those big bronze doors, when you open them up, there it is. A very famous carving of the weeping angel. This is the tomb I was telling you about, where the stained glass window sheds the blue light on the angel. I remember the first time my brother get those doors open and I saw this. I couldn't believe it. And I wondered, what on earth would make an angel cry? It truly is exquisite. This isn't the only rendering of the weeping angel. There's one in Paris, probably the original. But this one is quite beautiful, probably because it's protected inside the white marble tomb, the granite tomb. And she's made out of beautiful white marble, and with the blue light of the stained glass window, she looks like she's from another world. Absolutely beautiful, and all the detail I can remember looking. Well, this one's kind of fun. This is actually a bell from a steamboat. This is Cooley. He was one of the last great captains of steamboats on the Mississippi River. And that was the bell from his last ship. There we go. And that was one of the last steamboats right here. And that's the bell. See the bell sitting right there? And now it sits atop his tomb. Yep. Captain Cooley, Leverrier Cooley. He was born in 1855 and died in 1931. Yep. Now, my family tomb, I told you it's right here. This is the grandstand used to sit over here. So as the track went out, this is a 1-mile track all the way around. See the main drag is right here where the biggest oak trees are. And this is the 1-mile loop right there. And my family tomb is right here in the far turn, right about there. It's beautiful as you drive up to it, and there it is. My great-grandfather, James Wilson, built this tomb, but he's there. My great-grandparents, some aunts and uncles, great-aunts and uncles, my grandparents, and now my mother and father. The nice thing is about these tombs, you just open them up and put the remains right in, so you can keep the burials going. My sister Cindy is there. This is my uncle who was killed in Burma. His body was never returned for burial. His body was lost, was never found, even though they had confirmed they knew he was dead. But and those were some flowers that I brought out for All Saints' Day. Well, I like to keep flowers on the tomb. It's a tradition in my family. This one. This one's right next to it. Dr. Palmer. He was a later pastor of the First Presbyterian Church. But the nice thing about his, when I was a child, he's right next door to us. It's this nice, smooth, black granite. And it made a great slide. And I can remember when I was a child, little child, 3 or 4 years old, sliding down it. And my mother laughed and said, "Oh, yeah, I used to do the same thing." Family traditions are wonderful. Well, I hope you enjoyed my tour of Metaire Cemetery. It's a place I spent many hours when I was young, and I still like to visit as an adult when I go home. It's just part of going home. In the meantime, till I see you all again, God bless you.